This is John Spink, your instructor today. I'm Director and Assistant Professor at the Food Fraud Initiative at Michigan State University in the U.S. I have many activities globally that include as a member of the Food Fraud Think Tank for the Global Food Safety Initiative, an industry organization. I'm also on the expert panel for U.S. Pharmacopoeia for their food ingredient intentional adulteration activities. I'm a visiting scholar at Queen's University Belfast, and that's in the UK, and I also am involved in many activities around the world. The presentation today is Food Fraud Prevention Overview, and this is presented in Beijing on August 27th, the year 2015 at CFSA headquarters, and the focus group is Insight for the 13th Five-Year Plan. There are more resources in the appendix. First, I'd like to point out a recent publication that we co-authored with CFSA, among others, and it was introducing food fraud, including translation and interpretation to Russian, Korean, and the Chinese languages. This was published in the very respected international journal Food Chemistry. This is an important document because it was published in English in the primary source, but it included translations to the other languages. And a key is that they were translations by local scholars and food safety experts in their countries. Since they were experts in their country, this document can become a reference in their language in their country. And this has been a real key concept because many times the two scholars working together can learn the process and learn the details, but it's very difficult for this to continue to share the information across the country. And if this is presented in the local languages, then that increases the communication and collaboration within the country, but also with us across the world. Future translations are planned for us as a research team, and we would like to propose translating more documents between English and Chinese and English. Translations are critical for collaboration. Defining food fraud. It's important to take a moment to just review the basic definitions so we can continue our discussion. First, food fraud is deception using food for economic gain. And that's a key to think broadly about this topic. It's all types of fraud. The fraudsters or criminals are looking to make money. It's irrelevant that they consider an adulterant, a substance, or counterfeiting, or stolen goods, or any type of activity. And all this activity, if it does occur, leads to a drop in consumer confidence. Food fraud includes the subcategory of economically motivated adulteration, which is a common term used around the world. FDA, the US FDA currently defines EMA as a substance for economic gain. The term EMA is defined as a subcategory under food fraud, and it's not being used as much. The more holistic food fraud term is definitely more common since it's broader and it covers the whole category. This broad definition of food fraud is consistent with activities or publications for GFSI, for the European Commission, including the European Union, the United Kingdom, international standards organizations, and others. The motivation is economic gain, and this is really important because we often get thinking about detecting the product, catching the product, or the hazards involved, but we have to remember that the fraudster or criminal is trying to make money. And so our focus, while important to focus on detection, we must think about reducing their motivation. If we want to prevent this, we need to reduce their motivation. Also at this point, it's important to define and review food defense. The term food defense applies to intentional acts to harm, with the intent to harm. And that's different than food safety and different than food fraud. Defining food fraud. The effect. There's always an economic threat. This is a drop in consumer confidence, a loss to an economy. It is a negative factor for food manufacturers or producers because they are getting cheated. And what we found from research is consumers assume that food safety agencies, are preventing this. So that's a key, that there's an expectation from the consumer that the government is preventing, not just detecting food fraud. And that includes the economic threat, even if there is no public health threat. regarding the public health threat is it's very infrequent that food fraud has a public health threat, but there's always a vulnerability. And a key is that even with a product like horse meat in the UK, for the food fraud event there, the horse meat did not have a public health threat, but it could have. And there's no way we could have traced the product in case there was a normal food safety incident. So that's why there's always a vulnerability. So a food fraud incident should lead to a recall because of that vulnerability. I've listed many examples that I won't go into at this point. The food risk matrix. This is important to understand where food fraud fits into the hierarchy of all activity. And we say here it's prevent by understanding the motivation. And that's a key, is that we're not just trying to catch the product, we're trying to prevent it. So we need to look at the motivation or the reason, the root cause that it gets into the supply chain. Before looking at the food risks, to first define and look at the term food security. Food security is the safe, nutritious, continuous supply of food. It's not protecting the food against attack. So that's a constant supply. It also, when there is more food security and when the food risks in general are reduced, there's an increased supply of food because more farmers, more producers are able to make more product that gets to market. They're also more confident and more motivated to make the product because they believe that they will have a market for this product. It leads to longer supply chains. So when the product is being controlled across all the food risks, including food safety and food quality, then product can move farther and take longer supply chains. And with urbanization of the world, it's important that we reduce the waste of damaged product. Even a food quality incident, such as a bruised fruit, can lead to product that isn't sold at the retailer. Also, this does support the agriculture sector of the market because those producers, those farmers, will be able to produce more product and generate more revenue for themselves in general. This increases the domestic value because more product is able to be sold, more higher quality product is being able to be sold. This increases the consumer confidence in the product and leads consumers to be more willing to buy more premium products as well. This also increases the export value. So the more product that's produced and the higher quality that's produced, it can be consumed domestically and it also can be exported. This also continues to support the ag sector. The first side is food safety. It's the first type of food risk. Then food defense. Food fraud is separate here, and food quality. A key is we're looking at the motivation or the root cause of why something occurs. If a fruit is bruised in a food quality incident, it may not be a food safety incident. It may just be thrown out or waste. A food fraud incident that's only economic would not fall into a food safety incident category as a result. But food defense has the intent to harm. To give more detail, the actions on one side are unintentional. These are not intentionally created. On food fraud and food defense, the actions are intentional. The bad guys know what they're doing and what they put in the product. For food defense and for food safety, there's harm. And for food defense, that's public health, economic, or terror. For food fraud, the motivation is economic gain. And a key is that the fraudster or criminal is trying to make money. This is something that we can leverage and we can use to reduce their incentive and to reduce their motivation to conduct the act in the first place. The Global Food Safety Initiative has adopted a food safety management umbrella. And this is very logical because there's many types of companies or agencies that deal with food safety. And so under this umbrella is food safety on the left. That's a HACCP type program, hazards. Food defense is defined separately, and the food defense vulnerability should be separate from food safety. If the same type of vulnerability assessment is used, then one incident will be vastly different in the assessment, but still very important separately. So that's TACCP, threat assessment. And then food fraud is defined by GFSI as a separate column. This is VASIP, vulnerability assessment. One thing that one of my colleagues, a food control editor, Dr. Joseph Jen, states is test the process, not the product. And that's a key here with GFSI. They're looking at food safety management systems. It's looking that processes are in place, and that if those processes are in place and solid and sound, then it will reduce incidents. It will reduce the amount of product that needs to be tested. VASIP and TASIP are important because they're similar in concepts and theories and terminology even from HACCP. So they're a process and they're similar concepts and they're scaled implementation. This is key as well. Just like HACCP can apply to very small enterprises or very large, VASIP can also be for food fraud. And really looking at this with these three columns is the next iteration of food safety management. This is just looking in more detail at the types of risks that we are facing. This also builds and leverages and supports the current food safety infrastructure. Ultimately, we're trying to reduce the hazards, the public health hazards, and to do that, we need to prevent all the root causes that lead to those hazards. Now, some root causes are going to be more important than others, and so we'll prioritize those. Food fraud mitigation. This was a recommendation from the Food Fraud think tank that is being implemented now. It absolutely is being implemented, and companies are already doing process improvement to be more efficient at this. And the first is the vulnerability assessment itself, looking at the vulnerability. And as it says, think like a criminal. The second is a vulnerability control plan. So first you identify your vulnerability, and then you put a plan in place. The first key that's important here is that it leverages global best practices that are currently underway. These are going on now. So if a company, a country, or an association adopts these concepts, then there's already momentum and insight and best practices. It applies to all size companies, and this is something that's important about HACCP and GFSI, is it does apply to all size companies. This is more detail on the key elements for food fraud prevention, and I'll just leave this and not read it. You can have it as an attachment. To give you a little background on the GFSI process and how it connects with governments and regulations, I'll show you this schematic here. First off, on the far left, GFSI created a guidance document. It's a harmonized set of principles for food safety management systems. They're ideas of what should be in a system, and they're created by regulations. So governments have set regulations in place, expectations in marketplace, and so GFSI has harmonized these across from many countries. So first is the idea of what should be in a food safety management system. Next is a set of companies that create a standard. GFSI does not create the standard, other companies do. And there's a wide range of companies that sometimes focus in different areas. And so they create a standard of what actually is required to meet the expectations of GFSI. And then companies do it. They implement the standard. They look at the processes and systems that need to be in place, and they implement them. And then certification bodies or third-party audits confirm that the manufacturer did it, and they apply to the standard, and the standard is aligned with the idea. And the key here is that at the end, these confirmed third-party audits that are published by those auditing companies, governments could require a process for food fraud prevention, and one of those processes could be the GFSI certification. And the loop continues because once a government requires a food fraud vulnerability assessment and prevention plan, that leads to that regulation that then drives GFSI and drives industry. So a cycle is created. At this point, it's very efficient for governments because they can focus on the process, and a process that's being implemented globally. So there won't be separate regulations in different countries. Of course, some details may be different by company, but since the government requires a process, that will be included and understood in the regulations, and that will be a part of the process as well. Criminology, the chemistry of the crime. So to step back and look at that vulnerability assessment and look at the overall theory of how prevention occurs is to look at crime science. And this is the fraud opportunity or the criminal opportunity. And this is a triangle. We're trying to reduce the surface area of the triangle by reducing those legs. The first leg is the victim. That's a consumer not getting the product that they think they're buying. That's a retailer receiving product that is fraudulent, a manufacturer losing that sale, or countries not getting taxes. And the bottom side is a fraudster. There are a near infinite number of fraudsters. There's so many fraudsters in the world that it's very challenging to try to catch them to reduce the fraud opportunity. But it's important to understand them so that we can persuade them not to act. And the guardian and hurdle gaps, this side of the triangle is where we have the most impact as academics, as industry, and as governments and working together. Guardians are people that are monitoring, such as a lab technician looking at product. Hurdles are things that we put in place that make it harder for the bad guy to conduct this fraud. That could be traceability, authentication, other types of tests. And the things that we do is first detect. Important to know that we find it. Deter is then preventing it from or reducing the potential for it to happen. And prevent is the ultimate goal, where bad guys don't even try to attack. As a Chinese example, the negative list, the blacklist, is a detection list. Once an adulterant is known to be in the marketplace and dangerous, it's on the list, it can be detected. Knowing that that product can be detected leads to deterrence, because criminals will try to not use those chemicals. A key will be us to continue to look proactively to find those products as they become more prevalent in the marketplace, and maybe we even try to understand a fraud opportunity. We might identify a product that hasn't been caught yet as a fraudulent act, as food fraud, but we might identify its fraud opportunity is so high that that product could be proposed to be put on a negative list even before there's an incident. That would truly be prevention, and that would truly be a very proactive process. So one thing that when we look at this, we need data and we need information to understand what's going on. One bit of data there is to review incidents. So to collect databases of incidents and information on incidents is critical to understand why there's a fraud opportunity and why it occurs. Vulnerability assessments are important to understand how important is this problem? How big is the problem? There's a different set of data needs there. One thing that's really important to look at is this vulnerability assessment should be done for food fraud in general, but really separated by the different types of food fraud. So a smaller, more simple vulnerability assessment for each type of fraud, including adulterants, tampering, which could be date codes, could be relabeling, theft, stolen goods, overruns. That's production that's unauthorized and not following good manufacturing practices, diversion or gray market products, and counterfeit products. That's intellectual property rights violations, such as trademark. And the key is, what information or data do you need to answer what question? So I'll cover databases later, but that's really important to look at the process to see what type of data you need. Also, the goal is to reduce the fraud opportunity. Consumer confidence, or reducing the fraud opportunity, does increase consumer confidence and increases gross domestic product growth because there's more confidence in the supply chain. Global activities. As of August 2015, first, the UK Elliott Review. This covered food fraud and food crime. It covered a broad range of food fraud definitions, and the UK has implemented food fraud networks and food fraud task forces to look at the threat holistically across all fraud, and then identify different agency activities that lead to prevention. The European Commission has a resolution on food fraud, and the European Parliament has a focus on food fraud as well. They define this broadly of all types of fraud, and they focus on prevention. The European Commission is specifically looking at food integrity, which would be more than just adulterants or substances. That's product coming from the specific regions. So if it's Irish beef, that it really is from Ireland. Interpol Operation Opsin 4 now. They've had the fourth operation. So Interpol is involved. They started looking at more intellectual property rights, counterfeiting, and smuggling, but it's broadened to all types of fraud. This is a key point because it brings together law enforcement from around the world and sharing of best practices. GFSI guidance document. I mentioned this before. GFSI held a food fraud think tank, and that led to a food fraud mitigation position paper. And that led to food fraud vulnerability assessment workshops and a focus on food fraud vulnerabilities. PAS 96, Publicly Available Standard 96, is on food defense, which is the intentional act to harm. And they expanded that in the UK to include products that were put in intentionally for economic gain, but only substances, not all types of fraud. Second set of global activities. International Standards Organization, Fraud, Countermeasures, and Controls is a technical committee. They cover all types of fraud, and so there's best practices, things that can be learned from across the product slate. Global Grocery Manufacturers Association, they've had a number of reports and activities in this area on brand protection and consumer product fraud. U.S. Pharmacopoeia and the Food Chemicals Codex has focused on adulteration, and they have an expert panel. The U.S. Food Safety Modernization Act, I will handle that in a couple slides later, but they are in the midst of providing their guidance on economically motivated adulteration, and they're still using the EMA term. Chinese food safety laws, well, you know about that, but traditional and non-traditional were separations, and looking at prevention. Corporate processes and systems. This is a real key to the entire process, is that the quality management process of HACCP and others such as Six Sigma, these are not new to industry. So if it's required for industry to implement a preventative plan, preventative controls that are based on quality management system principles, they already know these. So they're already considered to be best practices, and that's one thing called enterprise risk management, is the financial side of that. So there's already decision-making processes in place, and many companies have what's called a chief risk officer. For U.S. activities, GMA in January 2011, after the Food Safety Modernization Act, they produced a report called the Consumer Product Fraud Report. This is one that's referenced widely with some basic quotes that are in there, although it's not very data-driven. It was surveys of industry, so it's opinions. For the U.S., we saw early the GAO, Government Accountability Office. They assess how agencies are working together, and the first time we saw this mentioned was in 1996 and fruit juice adulteration, and they used the term economic adulteration, and they emphasized that it was only an economic impact and not public health. That, I think, did a disservice to the process because they did not look at the vulnerability, and this was then treated all the way along the way as not a food safety incident. In 2009, the GAO reviewed seafood fraud, and the Congressional Research Service reviewed that in 2009 and 2013. This demonstrates that there is interest and activity across the supply chain and across regulators in the governments, in this case specifically on seafood fraud. In 2009, FDA had a public meeting on EMA, economically motivated adulteration, and this was for all FDA-regulated products, including food, food ingredients, dietary supplements, dietary ingredients, cosmetics, tobacco wasn't involved then, medicines, medical devices, radiological devices, and others. It was really only focused on for food, but the original public meeting did focus FDA on all products. Then when the Food Safety Modernization Act came out, food fraud was considered to be under the intentional adulteration section, and that was managed by food defense, not food safety at that point. Moving on, there was a GAO report later that was a report on EMA, and it identified that not a lot was going on, that there were not efficient activities between the government agencies, and they clearly defined the expectation that FDA was accountable and would be responsible for preventing all threats, not just public health threats. Later, the Food Safety Modernization Intentional Adulteration Rule opened and closed, comment period, and this was looking at where food fraud fit in under this rule, and it fell under, at this point, food defense or police, law enforcement. Congressional Research Service then had a report on food fraud, and this is a key. The report was on food fraud and EMA. This is when it looked like the U.S. started to adopt a more broader definition of food fraud. That report then did focus on all food fraud and prevention. Later, in September 2014, the Food Safety Modernization Act shifted from the intentional adulteration rule, food defense. They shifted EMA or food fraud to the preventative controls rule. This is a shift from food defense or policing, catching product, defensive, to proactive preventative controls, which is food safety. So that's interesting that it moved it into the preventative controls rule. The preventative controls rule finalized without any comment on EMA, and that's coming out later. Presidential Task Force on Seafood Fraud. So seafood fraud has continued to be a high priority separate from EMA and food fraud. So there's some fractured activities going on that appear to be coming together. Then the Food Safety Modernization Act, they have a draft rule coming out in August, so could be any day now, a draft rule on EMA. And what will happen there is they'll define their direction, their intended direction on addressing EMA or food fraud. There'll be a 90 to 180 day comment period, and there'll possibly be public meetings. And then for 90 to 180 days, FDA will take the time to write the final rule and then publish it. At that point, we will know the formal direction of the U.S. on EMA or food fraud. Industry guidance. So there's several activities going on. First, U.S. Pharmacopoeia. They have an expert panel, and the key is they do not focus on food defense, even though they say they're intentional adulteration. So this panel terminology was created back earlier when food fraud was still under the intentional adulteration EMA rule. The key is the food fraud database there, and the food fraud activity looks at adulterant substances only, and really focuses on the detection methods. GFSI, I mentioned the food fraud think tank, the position paper, and that guidance document is due at the end of 2016. But with the position paper being produced, then that led to the standards scheme owners and the companies implementing food fraud anyway. So it's being implemented ahead of the actual guidance document. SSAFE is a NGO food-related food companies, and they are producing a food fraud vulnerability assessment for GFSI. So there's several food fraud vulnerability assessments being developed that are have a lot of activity already going on and are already global in nature. And then GMA, they have an economically motivated adulteration work group. They also are creating a vulnerability assessment, although at this point, it's only generally defined as all adulterant substances and only substances that lead to harm. So we're seeing different vulnerability assessments that are created, but they focus on different areas. Looking at incident databases, so the data that would go into these vulnerability assessments or the general assessments. U.S. Pharmacopoeia focused on, they have a food fraud database that really doesn't cover all food fraud. It focuses on adulterant substances for food ingredients. The NCFPD, the National Center for Food Protection and Defense, in the U.S., they have an EMA database that covers most types of fraud. It's U.S. focused. For example, there's for seafood fraud, 97% of the incidents are from one Florida-based report. So they're focused on the U.S. And the goal here was, for this database, was to just gather information to give a general perspective. So this database is effective in meeting its goal. The EU has a RASIF database for a rapid alert for different types of recalls, but their food adulteration section covers only or covers all types of food adulteration, which could be unintentional mislabeling. So it's not all food fraud. So all the incidents in there are not food fraud based on the motivation. And in the UK, the Food Standards Agency has an all food fraud fee-based access system. So there's limited information on this on their Horizon scanning system. The key is that there are food fraud databases, but they have a wide range of goals, so none are comprehensive. They're not intended to be comprehensive. Call to action. For academia, first focus on the motivation, and this is using behavioral sciences and criminology. So we need to look at how things occur and why to understand how we can deter them. It's like the difference between studying pesticide residue and E. coli getting in product. There's just different root causes, and you wouldn't use one for the other. And for academia, also shift from intervention and response to prevention. This is hard for, say, a food science group that's working on testing to then try to broaden to understand how their activity supports prevention. But fortunately, there's a lot more articles being published, so there's a lot more resources there. Define prevention value in terms of the technology and resources. So what I mean by this is that every system, technology, countermeasure in place should be defined in its role on prevention. So a traceability system does trace the product, but it should also be described why that's important from a prevention standpoint. Industry. Discuss the topic with governments and non-governmental organizations. Governments are listening and asking to be involved, or to have industry involved. So it's highly recommended industry does participate. Industry also should shift from risk assessment to vulnerability assessment. So risk is just that final assessment of what has occurred, incidents that are known to have occurred, and then shift to vulnerabilities to understand why a system may be vulnerable even if there's never been an incident. And this truly gets to prevention. And it doesn't have to be that complex. So I think that's something that people worry about that. But when you start to look at it, it can be a simple process. And fortunately, those vulnerability assessments are being developed already, as we mentioned. Food fraud prevention focus. Focus on all types of fraud. Of course, some are going to be a lot more dangerous or higher in the vulnerability than others, and that will come out in the vulnerability assessment. For governments, define food fraud rather than only addressing adulterants, and address it in laws, not just guidance documents. This, I think, is a real key, because when it's addressed directly in a law, then the agencies and the courts and the police have to follow up on this. And so it defines very clearly that this is not acceptable and it is a crime. Create and engage public-private partnerships. This is working with industry, academia, and others. This doesn't mean that it's directed by the public-private partnership, but it's informed. And there's been a lot of efficient groups within countries and around the world. Interpol is one of those activities, that Operation Opsin, that's been a public-private partnership. Assess food fraud separately from food safety and food defense. It's a separate risk assessment in general, but then, of course, the higher food safety incidents, public health threats would be higher in that vulnerability assessment. But it's important to start them assessing them separately. Prevention is measurable and is resource efficient. So if you implement a HACCP type system, you're looking for vulnerabilities in the supply chain. You can measure how often a product is tested, or the temperature of a refrigerator, or other types of activities. Prevention can be measurable, and it's very resource efficient, especially if you're monitoring the process instead of testing for products. Especially it's effective if it's holistic. Should be covering all types of fraud and those broad vulnerability assessments. And it can be quick. This is what's going to be amazing, I think, for countries, is that with things like GFSI and USP and others, there's activity already going on. So the first step of implementing a food fraud prevention plan, vulnerability assessment, those are already defined. So I think that's something that will be amazing, that I think this could be implemented very, very quickly. Overall prevention strategy then defines specific roles. So this is part of those laws being about food fraud. Have an overarching company-wide, country-wide overview, and then define specific roles under that, and roles that are prevention, and that could be such as preventative testing. With that, I'll say thank you.